Welcome to the Silent Empires, where the stories are quiet, the atmosphere is heavy, and every name carries a shadow behind it. This is a place built for late nights, calm voices, and the kind of storytelling that drifts slowly into your thoughts. No loud distractions, no interruptions, just uninterrupted journeys through worlds shaped by power, loyalty, silence, and time. If this story found its way into your night, take a moment to like the video. And before you disappear back into the dark, leave a comment telling me, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? I always wonder how many different corners of the world are listening together at the same moment. The story begins long after the boy from Brooklyn has become a name whispered in fear. New York City in the late 1970s is struggling to hold itself together. The economy is fragile, whole neighborhoods are worn thin by unemployment and heroin, and the old certainties of post-war prosperity have begun to crumble. In the shadows of this uneasy city, a network of quiet back rooms and unmarked social clubs exerts a different kind of power. Small business owners know the unspoken rules about who they must pay. Union officials accept that some contracts are decided before any bids are written. And on the evening news, the police commissioner talks about a rise in contract killings and unexplained disappearances, the kind of cases where bodies are rarely found and witnesses are even rarer. Federal agents listen to crackling wiretaps from cramped office cubicles, trying to match calm, coded conversations to real crimes. Names recur again and again. Crews of younger men handling stolen cars, illegal loans, and increasingly deadly problems. But behind some of the most troubling operations in Brooklyn, investigators keep hearing about a different figure. He is not loud, not flamboyant, and he does not seek the headlines that have already destroyed older bosses. He is described instead as disciplined, careful, and utterly committed to the secret society that has shaped his life since adolescence. His name is Anthony Gaggi, a small-statured man whose influence will stretch from Brooklyn street corners to the innermost circle of the Gambino crime family. To understand how he reached that point, and how the city around him helped create the opportunity for such a life, we have to go back to the world he was born into. Anthony Gaggi entered that world on September 7, 1925, in New York City, at a time when the modern skyline was still taking shape, and the memory of the immigrant journey was fresh in his parents' minds. His family came from Sicily, part of the huge wave of southern Italian migration that had transformed New York since the late 19th century. The Gaggis settled in Brooklyn in the Williamsburg area, a dense patchwork of tenements, small storefronts, churches, and social clubs where Italian, Jewish, Polish, and other immigrant communities lived tightly side by side. It was a neighborhood defined by hard work and low margins, the kind of place where factory whistles set the rhythm of daily life, and cash was often counted more carefully than dreams. For the generation of Anthony's parents, New York represented both escape and uncertainty. Sicily at the time they left was marked by rural poverty and a deep mistrust of distant authorities, shaped by centuries of foreign rulers and local power brokers. In that environment, families learned to rely on themselves, on close-knit kinship networks, and on private codes of loyalty and silence. When they arrived in Brooklyn, those habits did not disappear. They were adapted to a new setting. The police in New York spoke a different language, both literally and culturally, and the courts seemed distant and intimidating. Among many Sicilian families, there was a reflexive inclination to settle disputes among themselves, to avoid drawing attention from officials, and to respect men who could make things happen without going through official channels. That unwritten code formed the background noise of Anthony's childhood. The Gaggi household, like many others in Williamsburg, was modest. Money was never abundant, and the late 1920s and early 1930s were harsh years. Anthony was still a small boy when the stock market crash of 1929 rippled through the city. Factories cut shifts, casual labor dried up, and food lines appeared in parts of Manhattan. In working-class Brooklyn neighborhoods, Families doubled up in cramped apartments. Older children took whatever jobs they could find, and mothers stretched every dollar. For a child growing up in that atmosphere, the difference between those who struggled publicly and those who seemed to have ready cash was impossible to miss. In those same streets, organized crime was already present, though it did not yet have the formal structure it would later adopt. The legacy of prohibition still hung in the air. The 1920s had given illegal liquor wholesalers and their protectors unprecedented money and influence. With the repeal of prohibition in 1933, liquor itself ceased to be illegal, but the networks of smugglers, enforcers, and fixers did not simply fade away. They redirected their experience into other areas: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and control of certain unions and industries. In neighborhoods like Williamsburg, young men could see that some of the sharp-dressed older generation did not work conventional factory shifts, but somehow always had money to spend and favors to grant. Anthony grew up in the middle of this transformation. As a second-generation Italian-American, he straddled two worlds. At home, the Sicilian dialect, Catholic feast days, and family gatherings rooted him in the old country's traditions. Outside, English-speaking schoolteachers and American-born peers pulled him toward a different identity. The public schools of Brooklyn in the 1930s were crowded and under-resourced, and for boys in particular, the promise that education alone would open every door was difficult to believe when they saw their fathers and older brothers worn down by low-paying jobs. For some, the schoolyard gave way early to the street corner, and the street corner sometimes led to small-time hustles, carrying packages, passing along bets, looking out for police. What makes Anthony Gaggi's story distinct is not simply that he came from this environment, but that he had direct proximity to the highest levels of the emerging Italian-American underworld. Widely cited accounts from law enforcement and later researchers note that through a connection by marriage, his extended family was linked to Frank Scalise, a prominent figure who would become underboss of what evolved into the Gambino crime family. In the rigidly hierarchical world of organized crime, blood and marriage ties mattered enormously. They did not guarantee a career in the organization, but they opened doors that would remain closed to outsiders. For a boy from a struggling Brooklyn family, to have even indirect access to a man who wielded that kind of quiet power was significant. It would be misleading to imagine a young Anthony receiving formal instruction in crime from early childhood. No reliable records support such cinematic depictions. But he grew up knowing that some relatives lived by different rules and had different options than the average factory worker or shopkeeper. In a culture where social status and masculine identity were often tied to the ability to provide, protect, and command respect, it was not hard for a young man to view the men of respect in his orbit as models of success. They dressed better, spoke with authority, and were treated carefully even by people who disliked them. The wider city around him was changing too. During Anthony's teenage years, World War II drew hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers into military service or war-related industry. Brooklyn's shipyards and factories boomed, providing jobs that, for a time, eased some of the economic pressure on neighborhoods like Williamsburg. But the war also created openings for black markets and for organized groups willing to manipulate rationing, labor supply, and military contracts. The Italian-American underworld, which by then had already begun to formalize into the structure known as the Five Families, continued to entrench itself in strategic areas: waterfront unions, wholesale food markets, trucking routes, construction contracts. For young men like Gaggi, adolescence unfolded against this complicated backdrop. The official path to advancement was clear enough: finish school if possible, find steady work in a trade or factory, marry, and slowly build a better life. For some of his peers, that path was viable. For others, including those who had access to influential criminal figures, the alternative path, though dangerous, seemed to promise more control and quicker rewards. By the mid-1940s, Anthony was a young adult in a city of contradictions. Patriotic rallies and war bond drives coexisted with rigged card games in back rooms. Public campaigns for law and order clashed with the quiet tolerance of long-established rackets. The documentary record of Anthony Gaggi's precise movements in those years is fragmentary, as is often the case for rising figures in organized crime. Law enforcement tended to focus its resources on more visible bosses or violent street crews, and many early activities left no official trace. What can be said with confidence, however, is that by the late 1940s and early 1950s, his name began to appear in the notebooks and confidential reports of detectives and federal agents mapping the Brooklyn wing of the Gambino organization. He was observed spending time in and around social clubs and cafes that investigators had identified as gathering spots for known members and associates. These social clubs played a central role in his world. To a casual passerby, they looked like modest, often unimpressive storefronts with frosted windows or drawn blinds. Inside, their functions were far more significant. They were places where older figures discussed business, where disputes could be mediated, where information circulated with remarkable speed, and where potential newcomers were quietly evaluated. Being allowed to sit, listen, and run errands in such a place was, in itself, a sign of trust. For someone with family ties to a respected underboss, the threshold was easier to cross, but continued presence depended on reliability and discretion. In this environment, Gaggi developed the traits that would define his criminal career. Accounts from investigators and later witnesses portray him as serious-minded and controlled rather than impulsive. He was not known for seeking noisy confrontations in public. Instead, he cultivated a reputation as a dependable earner, someone who could be trusted to manage financial operations, collect debts, oversee gambling activities, and ensure that money flowed upward through the hierarchy. In the culture of Cosa Nostra, as the American mafia families called themselves, this kind of steady competence was often valued more highly than raw physical intimidation. Violence, when it occurred, was supposed to be calculated and discreet, not reckless. The 1950s were a pivotal decade for both New York City and for Gaggi personally. On the surface, the city enjoyed a post-war boom. Suburban developments expanded, new highways cut through old neighborhoods, and consumer culture flourished. Yet beneath the prosperity, organized crime was consolidating. The family that would eventually bear Carlo Gambino's name traced its roots through earlier bosses, first Vincent Mangano, then Albert Anastasia, before Gambino emerged as a powerful, cautious leader adept at avoiding unnecessary attention. He emphasized low-profile, high-profit enterprises and placed great importance on having capable lieutenants who could control street-level activities without drawing headlines. It was into this structure that Anthony Gaggi was gradually absorbed. Through his connection to established figures and his proven ability to generate income, he moved from being a peripheral helper to a recognized associate whose loyalty was not in question. Informal responsibilities became more formal. He participated in gambling operations, extending illegal credit to bettors and small business owners, and collecting on those debts. Loan sharking, in particular, became a defining feature of his early Underworld portfolio, providing cash at interest rates far above those permitted by law, backed not by contracts, but by the implicit threat of consequences for non-payment. Even in describing these activities, it is important not to romanticize them. While they did create an aura of power and respect around men like Gaggi, they also deepened cycles of hardship in communities that could ill afford more burdens. Borrowers often turned to such lenders because they had already been refused by banks or legitimate financiers, and failure to repay could lead to intense pressure. Law enforcement officers who later built cases against Gaggi and his associates repeatedly encountered victims who had lived for years under the strain of such debts. paying and paying, yet never seeming to escape. By the end of the 1950s, Anthony Gaggi had effectively chosen his path. He was no longer just a son of Sicilian immigrants from Williamsburg trying to find his place in America. He was an entrenched member of a criminal subculture that offered both opportunity and peril. The values of loyalty, family honor, and mutual aid that had shaped his childhood were reshaped within the strict, secretive code of the Gambino family. Advancement depended on continued proof of usefulness and obedience to orders issued from above, even when those orders conflicted with broader social norms or personal safety. The stage was set for his formal induction into Cosa Nostra, and for a career that would entwine his fate with some of the most notorious operations in the history of New York organized crime, altering not only his own life, but the lives of many who crossed his path. That formal step into the inner circle came at a moment when both Anthony Gaggi and the American underworld were crossing important thresholds. By the late 1950s, the loosely organized gangs of Prohibition and the Depression era had evolved into a more structured, secretive network. Law enforcement was slowly learning to call it by its proper name, Cosa Nostra, the our thing described by insiders, and the federal government was beginning to realize that this was not a scattering of local rackets, but a national system with rules, leaders, and a capacity for long-term planning. Within that system, the family that would come to be known as the Gambino organization occupied a central role. Underboss Frank Scalise, the powerful relative whose name already carried weight in the Gaggi household, had helped shape its early growth. His assassination in 1957, shot down in a Bronx fruit market, signaled a moment of internal turmoil. That same year, the now famous Appalachian meeting in upstate New York was raided by state troopers, exposing dozens of high-ranking figures to public view and embarrassment. Many of the bosses present fled into the woods or abandoned their cars in a panic. Their arrest records and license plates provided the first large-scale, concrete evidence that a nationwide criminal confederation existed. For the younger generation in Brooklyn, Appalachian sent a clear message. The era of casual public gatherings among leaders was over. Meetings would need to be smaller, more local, and more tightly controlled. The men who rose in this environment would be those who understood the value of discretion. Anthony Gaggi, by temperament and habit, fit this mold. While the newspapers splashed photographs of flustered dons across their front pages, he stayed in the world he knew best. The modest social clubs, side street cafes, and small businesses of Brooklyn, where the real work of the organization still happened out of sight. Sometime in this period, in the late 1950s or very early 1960s, Gaggi crossed a line that separated mere associates from full members. Unlike a trial transcript or a census entry, an initiation ceremony into Cosa Nostra does not appear in public records. Its details are known only because a handful of former insiders later described the general ritual in court and to investigative committees. A small, private gathering, the pricking of a finger, an image of a saint burned in the hand, an oath to place the family above all other loyalties and never cooperate with authorities. No one can point to an exact date for Gaggi, but by the early 1960s, FBI memoranda and New York Police Department intelligence reports alike were describing him not simply as a hanger-on, but as a made soldier in the Brooklyn wing of the Gambino family. This change in status was not a mere formality. As a soldier, Gaggi was no longer just a useful neighborhood figure. He was now part of a rigid hierarchy. Above him stood his caporgine, the captain responsible for a given crew of soldiers, and above that, the underboss and boss. Below him were trusted associates who did not meet the ethnic or trust criteria for formal membership, but could still do significant work. In return for formal protection, status, and the opportunity to make money through sanctioned criminal activities, a soldier owed unquestioning obedience to orders from above, regular payments from his operations, and a promise to enforce the family's interests. His rise was eased by his family connections and his record of reliability, but it was also shaped by broader changes within the Gambino organization. After the turmoil surrounding Anastasia's violent removal and the internal disputes of the late 1950s, Carlo Gambino emerged as boss. He was nothing like the flamboyant gangsters celebrated or vilified in popular imagination. Gambino favored quiet influence. He built a network in which violence was a tool, not a lifestyle, and where the emphasis fell on long-term control of unions, shipping, construction, and loan sharking rather than on dramatic public gestures. Men such as Gaggi, serious, organized, and comfortable in the shadows, matched this philosophy. In practical terms, the life of a soldier in this period revolved around money, how to generate it, protect it, and make sure the correct share moved up the chain. In Brooklyn, this often meant illegal gambling and high-interest loans, bookmaking on sports, card games with the odds subtly tilted in the house's favor, and policy or numbers games drew steady streams of small wagers from working-class residents. To many customers, these games functioned as an informal lottery and a kind of entertainment. To the organization, they were dependable cash generators. Loan sharking, meanwhile, preyed on people and businesses who lacked access to legitimate credit. Shop owners behind on rent, truck drivers in debt, gamblers chasing losses, and ordinary people facing medical or family emergencies sometimes turned to neighborhood lenders associated with the family. Anthony Gaggi proved adept at organizing these operations. Investigative files from the era would later describe him as a central figure in Brooklyn-based gambling and lending schemes, whose influence extended into parts of Queens and beyond. He cultivated a veneer of ordinary respectability, maintaining a modest public profile. Like many in his position, he had links to seemingly legitimate enterprises, small businesses where associates could meet, jobs that provided a plausible explanation for income or presence in certain areas. These fronts were not large corporations. They were neighborhood-level operations that allowed him to move with less obvious suspicion. Law enforcement's view of him in these years was pieced together bit by bit. Arrest records from New York show that he, like most career criminals of his rank, encountered the criminal justice system periodically on charges connected with gambling and related offenses. These cases rarely led to significant prison time. Fines, suspended sentences, or short stints behind bars were more common, outcomes shaped both by the limited evidence available and by the careful way in which he insulated himself from direct involvement. To the outside world, he appeared as a low-key neighborhood man who somehow managed to avoid serious consequences despite frequent mention in the notebooks of detectives and agents. Meanwhile, the national climate around organized crime was shifting. In 1963, Joseph Valachi, a member of the Genovese family, broke the code of silence and testified at length before the United States Senate. His televised hearings introduced millions of Americans to terms like Cosa Nostra and the Commission, and confirmed that the Underworld did, in fact, have a structure resembling a clandestine corporation. He spoke in general terms about the initiation ritual, the family system, and the concept of soldiers, captains, and bosses. While he did not name every active figure, his testimony emboldened federal agencies to invest more energy in penetrating these organizations. For men like Gaggi, Valachi's disclosures and the attention that followed did not change their daily routines overnight, but they deepened an already strong culture of caution. Telephone conversations became even more guarded. Important discussions were held in person, often while walking outside or sitting in public places where the risk of electronic surveillance seemed lower. Cars were checked for listening devices, and meetings in social clubs were kept small and staggered. The strain of maintaining this vigilance shaped the character of middle-level figures. They needed to be disciplined enough to constantly think about security, but flexible enough to adapt to new opportunities and pressures. By the mid-1960s, Anthony Gaggi had become one of those Middleville figures. He was still far from the inner circle that decided questions of leadership and long-term strategy, but he controlled a meaningful share of the Gambino family's business in specific Brooklyn neighborhoods. Members of the community who needed favors, feared retaliation from others, or wanted access to money they could not get from a bank increasingly found themselves dealing with people who answered, directly or indirectly, to him. His reputation inside the organization was that of a strict but effective operator. He demanded payments on time, discouraged unnecessary displays of force, and insisted that his subordinates observe basic discipline. This period also saw the beginning of the relationship that would eventually define his public notoriety. In Brooklyn's rougher corners, a generation of younger men was coming of age in the 1950s and 1960s without the memories of the old country that had shaped their parents. They were American-born, familiar with public schools, television, and the shifting culture of post-war America. Some drifted into petty crime simply as a way to make more money than low-wage jobs offered. Others actively sought out connections to the men they knew controlled the real power in their neighborhoods. Among these younger men was a Brooklyn native named Roy DeMeo, born in 1942, who as a teenager gravitated toward small-time theft and later the lucrative world of stolen cars. DeMeo was ambitious, energetic, and skilled at organizing his peers for profitable schemes. At some point in the mid to late 1960s, their paths crossed. The exact circumstances differ slightly from source to source. Introductions in this world were often arranged through multiple intermediaries, but the underlying fact is well established. DeMeo came under the wing of Anthony Gaggi and became closely associated with him for the rest of his criminal career. To Gaggi, DeMeo represented both opportunity and risk. On the one hand, he was exactly the kind of enterprising younger associate that a Middleville soldier needed in order to expand his reach. DeMeo could handle the street-level work of gathering debts, overseeing gambling operations, and exploring new criminal markets. He was willing to take chances, eager to prove himself, and talented at recruiting loyal followers. On the other hand, his energy and drive meant that he would constantly push against the boundaries of what older, more conservative figures like Gaggi might have considered prudent. The partnership that developed was, in many ways, a textbook example of how Cosa Nostra adapted to new conditions. The older, fully initiated soldier provided access to the family's protection, contacts, and dispute resolution mechanisms. He acted as an intermediary between his younger associates and the upper ranks of the organization, smoothing over conflicts, explaining expectations, and making sure that a consistent share of profits flowed upward. In return, the younger associate expanded the scale and variety of operations on the ground, bringing new revenue streams into the orbit of the traditional family structure. Under Gaggi's guidance, DeMeo began to move from simple theft toward more complex ventures. Illegal loans tied to stolen car operations, gambling in bars and back rooms, and schemes involving fraudulent credit and insurance all became part of the portfolio. These were not spectacular crimes. They were incremental, accumulating money bit by bit from the vulnerabilities and temptations of everyday life in a large city. For shop owners and workers caught in the middle, the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate often blurred when a neighborhood figure could, with a quiet word, solve a problem or create a new one. By the late 1960s, law enforcement analysts were starting to notice the pattern. Internal reports began to describe a node of activity in certain Brooklyn districts where loan sharking, gambling, and property-related crimes seemed concentrated around a cluster of names, with Anthony Gaggi frequently appearing in the background as an organizer and beneficiary. At this stage, however, the evidence connecting him directly to the most serious allegations remained thin. Witnesses were reluctant to come forward, Paper trails were carefully obscured, and the use of intermediaries like DeMeo meant that Gaggi rarely had to appear at the scene of any specific act. Behind the scenes, his standing in the Gambino family continued to rise. Reliable insiders would later recall that he was increasingly treated as a man whose judgment on money matters could be trusted, someone who could be assigned an area or set of operations and expected to keep them running smoothly. He learned to balance the demands of his superiors with the unpredictable realities of the street, sometimes restraining DeMeo and his peers when they pushed too far, other times pressing them to be more aggressive in collecting debts or expanding revenue. The tension between caution and ambition that defined his personal style was gradually becoming the central tension of his professional life as well. As the 1960s drew to a close, New York itself was edging into a more turbulent era. Economic strains, social unrest, and changes in policing would soon reshape the entire landscape of crime and law enforcement. For Anthony Gaggi, now an established soldier with a growing network of associates and a particularly energetic protege in Roy DeMeo, the next decade would offer both unprecedented opportunities and unprecedented scrutiny. The quiet, methodical rise that had marked his early years in the organization was about to give way to a period in which the scale and consequences of his activities would draw attention far beyond the neighborhoods where his power had first taken root. The new decade opened with a sense of unraveling in New York City. The optimism that had colored the immediate post-war years was giving way to a more anxious mood. Factories were moving to the suburbs or out of state. The city's finances were under strain, and whole neighborhoods felt left behind. In that climate, the kind of off-the-books services that organized crime offered, ready cash, informal protection, access to contraband, became even more attractive to people under pressure. For Anthony Gaggi, now a fully initiated soldier in the Gambino family with a promising younger associate in Roy DeMeo, this was the environment in which his influence would deepen. On the surface, he did not look like a man at the center of a growing criminal enterprise. Barely above average height, compactly built, often dressed in conservative suits, he blended easily into the Brooklyn streets where he had grown up. He lived on an unremarkable residential block, attended family events, and maintained the appearance of a man involved in small business. To neighbors who were not paying close attention, he could have been a middleville manager or shop owner. The secrecy that Cosa Nostra demanded suited him. He had no interest in the conspicuous displays that had doomed flashier gangsters in earlier decades. Behind that modest facade, the partnership with Roy DeMeo was transforming his position. DeMeo, almost 2 decades younger, had begun working for a legitimate Brooklyn bank in the 1960s. The job gave him insight into credit, paperwork, and the weaknesses of financial institutions. At the same time, he continued to cultivate contacts in the world of stolen cars and other illegal schemes. Through Gaggi, he had a direct line into the Gambino family's protection and approval. Through DeMeo, Gaggi gained access to new methods and markets that went beyond the traditional bookmaking and neighborhood loan sharking he had already mastered. One of the most lucrative of these ventures was the large-scale theft and resale of automobiles. The basic outlines of such operations were simple enough. Stolen vehicles could be stripped for parts, resold locally with altered identification numbers, or shipped overseas where documentation was harder to verify. Under DeMeo's leadership, and with Gaggi's backing, this became a well-organized business rather than a haphazard sideline. Corrupt contacts in legitimate sectors, mechanics, car dealers, employees in licensing offices were cultivated. Shell companies appeared on paper to provide a veneer of legitimacy. The money that flowed in did not just enrich the thieves. It was carefully divided upward, ensuring that Gaggi and through him, higher-ranking figures in the Gambino family had a direct financial stake. At the same time, Gaggi expanded his traditional core activities. Illegal gambling in bars, social clubs, and back rooms grew in scale. DeMeo's associates collected bets, managed books, and ran games where the odds ensured a consistent house advantage. Loan sharking operations, which had once been limited to small neighborhood clients, began to reach deeper into the city, struggling small business community. Shop owners behind on taxes or rent, truckers unable to cover repairs, and independent tradesmen facing slow months found envelopes of cash available if they accepted harsh repayment terms. To people with no better options, the choice could feel less like a decision than a necessity. In the culture of Cosa Nostra, money production translated directly into status. By the early 1970s, the volume of earnings that flowed up from Gaggi's operations marked him out as more than an ordinary soldier. He had demonstrated over several years that he could consistently deliver profits while maintaining the low profile valued by Carlo Gambino. Within the family, he was trusted to keep younger, more impetuous men in line, and to shield the upper hierarchy from the day-to-day risks of street-level crime. It was during this period, according to later accounts by law enforcement and cooperative witnesses, that he was elevated from soldier to captain, placing him formally in charge of his own crew within the Gambino structure. The promotion did not come with a public ceremony or a title on a door. It came in the form of deference from subordinates, directives from higher-ups, and a broader sphere of responsibility. Men who had once been his peers now treated him as their superior. Others, like DeMeo, became recognized subordinates operating under his protection. The crew centered itself geographically in parts of Brooklyn where Gaggi had long-standing roots. Small storefronts functioned as unofficial headquarters. One such place, a nondescript bar later notorious as the Gemini Lounge, became the inner hub of DeMeo's immediate group. On the outside, it looked like a modest neighborhood tavern, with regulars playing cards and talking sports. Behind the scenes, it was a point of contact where money changed hands, deals were discussed, and serious decisions were made. Although Gaggi did not spend every waking hour there, he was widely recognized as the crew's ultimate authority, the man whose approval or disapproval could shape a career. This evolution in his role coincided with major changes in how the United States approached organized crime. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO. For the first time, federal prosecutors had a legal tool designed not just to punish individual acts, but to target the leadership of ongoing criminal enterprises. Under RICO, someone who ordered or profited from a pattern of criminal activity could, under certain circumstances, be held legally responsible for the acts of subordinates. To figures like Gaggi, the full implications of this new law were not immediately obvious. For generations, the standard tactic had been to insulate bosses and captains from direct involvement in violent or overtly criminal acts wherever possible. Orders were given elliptically, through intermediaries, and most serious transactions were handled by men several steps removed from the top. This structure had protected older generations from conviction when specific cases could not be tied to them personally. RICO threatened to pierce that insulation, but it would take several years for prosecutors to learn how to use it effectively, and for the underworld to grasp how dangerous it might be. In the early to mid-1970s, therefore, Gaggi continued to operate on the assumption that careful delegation and strict discipline would shield him. His public behavior remained restrained. Law enforcement surveillance described him as cautious. He rarely used telephones for sensitive conversations, preferred face-to-face meetings, and kept his daily routines unpredictable. He discouraged associates from drawing attention to themselves with needless displays of wealth or public disputes. The same could not be said of all the men below him. Roy DeMeo, while unquestionably intelligent and capable, was more volatile. Ambition drove him to seize every opportunity, and he was willing to use force to remove obstacles. Over time, his immediate circle, men like Joseph Testa and Anthony Center, among others, developed a reputation among both criminals and investigators as particularly intimidating. Their involvement in violent enforcement on behalf of loan sharking and gambling operations, and in settling internal disputes, began to distinguish them from more conventional money-making crews. Here, the tension between Gaggi's conservative instincts and his need for effective enforcers became acute. On the one hand, he understood that the credible threat of serious consequences was part of what made illegal lending and gambling work. If debtors believed there would be no consequences for non-payment, the entire structure would collapse. On the other hand, overt intimidation and frequent resort to lethal violence risked attracting precisely the kind of intense police scrutiny that family leadership wanted to avoid. One area where this tension surfaced sharply was narcotics. Traditionally, the Gambino family, particularly under Carlo Gambino and later Paul Castellano, officially discouraged direct involvement in drug trafficking. The risks, heavy federal sentences, public outrage, and the corrosive effect of addiction in their own neighborhoods were deemed too high. At the same time, the profits involved were enormous, especially as the heroin trade expanded in the 1970s. Some younger associates, including people linked to DeMeo's group, dabbled in drug dealing despite explicit prohibitions. Accounts from insiders and investigators suggest that Gaggi, loyal to the leadership's position, repeatedly warned his crew against narcotics. He understood that if upper management believed he was permitting or profiting from drug dealing, his own career, and possibly his life, could be in jeopardy. Yet total control over the actions of ambitious young men spread across multiple overlapping operations was difficult to achieve. The result was an uneasy compromise. Public disavowal of drug activity, combined with sporadic quiet involvement by those willing to risk it, often denied or downplayed if discovered. Throughout this period, federal agencies steadily increased their focus on the Gambino family in general, and on the Brooklyn crews in particular. The FBI's New York office, having learned from the Valachi hearings and early RICO experience, obtained court authorization for more electronic surveillance. Wiretaps, listening devices in cars, and eventually hidden microphones in social clubs all became part of the investigative arsenal. Agents compiled charts showing connections among dozens of men, marking Gaggi as a central node, linking street-level operators like DeMeo with higher-ranking figures associated with Paul Castellano. Still, assembling enough evidence to bring a major case was difficult. Victims of loan sharking were understandably reluctant to testify, fearing retaliation. Many of the people aware of the group's activities were themselves involved in other crimes. Even when informants did come forward, their statements had to be corroborated by independent investigation. In the early 1970s, several efforts to build broader cases stalled, leaving Gaggi and his crew under observation, but not yet formally charged with the most serious offenses that investigators suspected. Events in 1974 briefly pushed him more directly into the legal spotlight. That June, federal agents were conducting surveillance on him and his associates, following closely as they moved through Brooklyn in separate cars. According to subsequent court records and contemporary news reports, Gaggi and others became aware of the tale and apparently concluded that they were being threatened, perhaps by robbers or rival criminals rather than by law enforcement. In the confusion, shots were fired from their vehicle at the trailing car. Only afterward did it become clear that the targets were FBI agents, one of whom was wounded. This incident stripped away some of the protection his low profile had provided. Firing on federal agents, whatever the claimed misunderstanding about their identity, was an extremely serious offense. Gaggi was arrested and charged in connection with the shooting. For the first time, his name appeared in mainstream press coverage not just as a suspected racketeer, but as a defendant in a case involving direct confrontation with law enforcement. In 1976, He was convicted in federal court of assaulting agents and related weapons charges, receiving a significant prison sentence. Yet even this high-stakes legal conflict did not remove him from the picture for long. Appeals and legal maneuvering reduced the practical impact of the sentence, and he avoided the kind of extended incarceration that might have broken his hold over his crew. While some time was spent in custody, he continued, through visits and intermediaries, to exert influence over the operations he had built. The federal government had succeeded in convicting him of a serious crime, but it had not yet dismantled the financial and organizational networks that sustained his authority. Meanwhile, Roy DeMeo and his immediate circle grew more entrenched in Brooklyn's criminal landscape. Their car theft and fraud operations became more sophisticated, incorporating forged documents, sham sales, and overseas buyers. Loan sharking and gambling proceeds continued to flow. With Gaggi as their link to the upper reaches of the Gambino family, they were able to call on additional manpower when needed and to claim a degree of protection against rival crews. Their reputation as problem solvers, albeit of a ruthless sort, spread beyond their immediate territory. For ordinary residents of the neighborhoods where they operated, the presence of this crew could be a source of both fear and assert uneasy dependence. Some small business owners quietly acknowledged that the men linked to Gaggi could, at times, resolve disputes, drive off thieves, or pressure delinquent customers in ways the police would not or could not. Others found themselves trapped by debts they could not reasonably repay, facing a mounting cycle of payments and threats. The underworld's ability to entwine itself with everyday economic life, offering short-term solutions that created long-term vulnerability, was one of the key reasons it proved so difficult to uproot. Upstairs in the higher echelons of the Gambino family, larger shifts were underway. In October 1976, Carlo Gambino died of natural causes, ending an era. After an internal succession process that blended quiet maneuvering with carefully managed shows of unity, Paul Castellano emerged as the new boss. Castellano represented a particular vision of organized crime, less emphasis on the old-style street rackets, more focus on white-collar schemes, union manipulation, and infiltration of legitimate industries such as construction and food distribution. He styled himself as a businessman as much as a traditional don. Men like Anthony Gaggi, already valued for their ability to generate steady income and maintain discipline without constant public disorder, fit well within Castellano's approach. He continued to enjoy the confidence of leadership, even as they became more concerned about the excesses of some Brooklyn crews. Castellano and his close advisors relied on captains to keep ambitious subordinates under control, feeding them profits while holding them back from actions that might attract too much attention. It was a delicate balancing act, and in the Brooklyn of the late 1970s, it was becoming harder to maintain. By the middle of that decade, federal and local law enforcement had grown increasingly alarmed by the pattern of unexplained disappearances and suspected contract killings linked, in one way or another, to the DeMeo crew. Victims included potential informants, business partners who had fallen out of favor, and individuals caught in the cross-currents of underworld disputes. While concrete evidence was often lacking, the very secrecy and fear that protected the killers also hindered investigations. The sheer number of missing persons and unsolved homicides in certain areas could not be ignored. Within this context, Anthony Gaggi occupied an ambiguous position. To federal agents charting connections on organizational diagrams, he was the key figure bridging the gap between the violent, entrepreneurial DeMeo circle and the ostensibly more insulated Castellano regime. To some in his own family, he was a loyal earner and enforcer who, whatever his methods, delivered results. To the communities around him, he was both a threat and, paradoxically to some, a man who could sometimes deliver quick help when official systems failed. As the 1970s edged toward their close, the contradictions embedded in his situation were becoming untenable. The economic hardships that had fueled demand for illegal loans and underground markets persisted, but the tolerance for unchecked violence was eroding, both within law enforcement and at the highest levels of the Gambino family. The same qualities that had propelled his rise, his ability to sponsor aggressive younger men, manage complex rackets, and navigate between street and boardroom, would soon draw him into the most serious legal battles of his life, as investigators slowly assembled the evidence to tie years of financial crime and fatal problems solving back to the quiet, disciplined captain from Williamsburg. By the time the second half of the 1970s arrived, the separate strands of Anthony Gaggi's life had woven into a single, tightly wound pattern. He was no longer simply a neighborhood figure with underground connections. He was a Gambino captain with a defined crew, a powerful patron in Paul Castellano, and a fast-growing criminal syndicate centered around his protege, Roy DeMeo. What began as a controlled expansion of gambling and loans in Brooklyn was evolving into a sprawling network that touched stolen cars, credit fraud, union-linked businesses, and, increasingly, violent solutions to financial and personal disputes. In public, very little of this was visible. Gaggi kept to the habits that had served him well: modest dress, predictable devotion to family gatherings, and a demeanor that did not invite curiosity. He was a husband and father who demanded strict discipline at home, especially from his daughters, whom he guarded closely. He attended church, maintained the rituals of his parents' generation, and could appear, to someone seeing only that side, as a strict but conventional Italian-American patriarch. But inside the network of social clubs, back rooms, and discreet restaurants that formed his real domain, he was something else entirely, an exacting manager of a high-risk enterprise. Associates who later spoke to investigators described a man obsessed with order and loyalty. He expected tribute, regular payments, from anyone operating under his umbrella, but he also expected punctuality, silence, and respect. Complaints reached him through channels. He listened, asked questions, and gave instructions in a calm, low-key manner that made it easy to forget that lives and livelihoods often hung on his decisions. The Gemini Lounge in Canarsie, the bar that became synonymous with the DeMeo crew, fit perfectly into this hidden world. During the day and early evening, it could pass as a typical working-class bar. Sports on the television, regulars at the counter, a jukebox humming in the background. After hours and in the back rooms, it functioned as an office, a meeting place, and in the eyes of law enforcement, the command center for a wide variety of criminal schemes. DeMeo presided over the daily operations there, but the authority behind him was understood. He answered to Nino. The division of labor within this structure reflected the generational and stylistic differences between them. DeMeo, in his 30s, was constantly in motion, recruiting young men from the neighborhood, arranging car theft rings, negotiating with businessmen in trouble, and dealing directly with those who failed to meet their obligations. He cultivated loyalty by sharing profits and stepping in when his people needed legal help or other support. His readiness to use intimidation, and at times lethal force, made defiance a rare and dangerous choice. Gaggi operated at a different altitude. He met DeMeo regularly, often at less conspicuous locations than the bar, to review numbers, settle disputes, and transmit instructions from higher up in the Gambino hierarchy. When DeMeo proposed new ventures, another stolen car pipeline, a fraud involving falsified invoices, an expansion of loan sharking into new territories, it was Gaggi who weighed the potential profits against the risk of excessive heat from police or rival crews. He had a reputation among his peers for asking the same hard questions in every meeting. How much will this make? Who might object? How visible will it be? This careful approach did not mean he shied away from aggressive action when he believed it necessary. Witness accounts gathered years later especially from his nephew by marriage Dominic Montiglio, portray a man who took great pains to present a composed exterior and a matter-of-fact attitude toward enforcement. Problems in his vocabulary were things to be straightened out or taken care of. The euphemisms were deliberate. In a world where direct statements could later be repeated in court, coded language served as both habit and shield. Everyone present, however, understood the potential implications. The question of narcotics weighed heavily on this world. Paul Castellano, who had succeeded Carlo Gambino in 1976, was firmly opposed to his men dealing in drugs. The profits were undeniable, but so were the legal risks and the damage done to the family's reputation among the very communities where it rooted itself. Castellano feared that the chaos surrounding drug dealing, addiction, unpredictable violence, intense police focus, would undermine the relatively stable and concealed rackets he prized. He made it clear through his captains that anyone caught trafficking could face the most serious internal penalties. Gaggi presented himself as an enforcer of this line. He warned his subordinates, including DeMeo, that involvement in drugs could bring ruin. In principle, he agreed with Castellano. Gambling and loans could be framed, however misleadingly, as matters of choice in business. Narcotics seemed to destroy the very communities they lived in. Yet the actual practice on the streets was murkier. Some of the younger men in the DeMeo crew, especially those less directly supervised, did engage in drug dealing. They viewed it as an additional revenue stream and believed they could keep it at arm's length from the core operations. Among those who straddled this forbidden line was one of DeMeo's earliest proteges, a brash young man named Chris Rosenberg. Raised in Brooklyn, Rosenberg had attached himself to DeMeo as a teenager, taking small errands, helping with stolen cars, and slowly earning trust. He idolized his mentor and, by extension, the reserved captain behind him. Over time, Rosenberg became closely associated with DeMeo's circle at Gemini, involved in both the car theft operations and in collecting for loan sharks and gambling. But Rosenberg also began to dabble in narcotics, both for personal profit and to impress others with his ability to generate money quickly. According to later testimony and investigative records, this activity did not go entirely unnoticed. Complaints filtered back, whispers that someone in the crew was active in drugs. Initially, these may have seemed like manageable excesses, a young associate stepping over a line who could be pulled back with a warning. The situation changed when federal drug agents moved in. By 1979, Rosenberg had become entangled in a narcotics investigation that threatened to expose not only his own activities, but potentially his connections to the wider Gambino network. Castellano, already deeply suspicious of the crew's reputation for violence and eager to draw a firm boundary around drug involvement, was alarmed. From his vantage point, the risk was twofold. Federal prosecution focused on narcotics could bring severe sentences and prompt someone under pressure to inform, and any association between his name and drug dealing undercut his carefully crafted stance as a legitimate businessman and old-world patriarch. The instructions that came down the chain were stark. Castellano wanted the problem removed in a way that sent an unmistakable message. Narcotics would not be tolerated. Those instructions were conveyed through the usual channels, through trusted intermediaries, via carefully phrased conversations. But the meaning was plain. As captain over the crew, Gaggi was responsible for enforcing them. The resulting dilemma reveals much about his position and his character. On one side was a young man who had grown up within his crew's orbit, who had been loyal and useful, and whose enthusiasm, however misdirected, had brought in money. On the other side stood the boss of the family, whose authority in this world was absolute. For someone like Gaggi, whose entire identity and career were built on obedience to the code of Cosa Nostra, there was no realistic choice. Personal feelings, if he allowed himself any, could not outweigh the hierarchy. Accounts from insiders later described how he relayed Castellano's demand to DeMeo. There were no theatrics. He explained that Rosenberg's recent arrest and continuing drug involvement had placed the entire crew in jeopardy. The boss was angry, and when the boss was angry, the options shrank quickly. DeMeo, who had looked on Rosenberg almost as a younger brother, resisted at first, but he too understood the rules they lived under. Eventually, he agreed to carry out the order. Rosenberg, unaware of the full extent of the leadership's anger, was lured into what he thought was a routine meeting and was killed by men he had trusted completely. In the bare language of a court transcript, the incident is just one more homicide linked to the DeMeo group. In human terms, it was a clear demonstration of how the system Gaggi helped maintain operated. Loyalty flowed upward, and when the demands of that loyalty collided with personal attachments, the latter gave way. The killing also underscored that Castellano's supposed absolute ban on drug dealing was, in practice, enforced selectively and often after the fact, once someone's exposure had become a liability. For investigators, cases like Rosenberg's were both revealing and frustrating. They pointed to internal tensions and confirmed that violence was used not only against rivals and debtors, but against insiders who had become problematic. Yet, without cooperative witnesses or direct physical evidence, tying such acts back to higher-ranking figures like Gaggi was extremely difficult. The individuals most directly involved rarely spoke, and when they did, fear and the threat of retaliation limited what they were willing to say. During these same years, the broader American public was becoming more aware that something unusual was happening in Brooklyn. Reports of missing persons, unexplained disappearances of small-time criminals and business people, and unsolved homicides accumulated. Local newspapers occasionally ran stories speculating about a murder ring, fueled by anonymous law enforcement sources who saw patterns in the case files. Still, the names of those suspected of orchestrating this violence did not yet dominate national headlines. Gaggi remained, for the most part, tucked away in the quieter pages of investigative memoranda and confidential intelligence bulletins. Inside the Gambino family, his stature continued to grow. Castellano, focused on higher-level rackets, construction, trucking, garment center schemes, meat distribution, valued captains who could keep their own territories profitable and, ideally, contained. So long as the money from Brooklyn arrived regularly, and no single incident forced unwanted media attention onto the entire organization, Gaggi was seen as doing his job. Questions about the methods employed by his subordinates were, at least for a time, muted by their economic success. Yet the very qualities that made his crew profitable were also making them a priority target. Federal prosecutors in Brooklyn and Manhattan, working in conjunction with the FBI and NYPD detectives, began to think in terms of long-term, enterprise-wide cases rather than isolated charges. RICO, which had sat relatively underused for its first few years, offered a framework. If they could show that Gaggi and others were part of an ongoing criminal enterprise engaged in a pattern of serious offenses, they could seek heavier penalties and hold higher-ups accountable for actions they had not personally carried out. Achieving that, however, required something the investigators still largely lacked: witnesses from inside. The tight culture of silence within Cosa Nostra, reinforced by genuine fear of retaliation and by a sense of fatalism among many lower-level figures, had long stymied such efforts. One of the critical shifts that would eventually change this dynamic was generational. Younger men who had not grown up in the old Sicilian milieu, who had seen friends disappear or go to prison, while senior figures seemed to continue their lives with relative comfort, were sometimes less inclined to keep faith with traditions that offered them little protection. Among those who watched Gaggi most closely during this period was his own nephew by marriage, Dominic Montiglio. Brought into the orbit of the Gambino family as a young man, Montiglio ran errands, sat in on meetings, and absorbed the unspoken lessons about who held power and how it was exercised. He saw his uncle's dual identity, the stern family man at home and the calculating captain in social clubs, working through lists of debts and disputes. Years later, Montiglio would break the code of silence and testify extensively about what he had witnessed. At the time, however, he was another pair of eyes and ears inside the network, helping to coordinate activities and carrying messages back and forth. Through such intermediaries, Gaggi maintained a tight grip on the many layers of his crew's operations. If a borrower fell behind on payments, someone reported it upward, and he decided on the response. Extra time, a warning visit, a demand for collateral, or, in more extreme cases, a decision that the risk of allowing the debt to linger outweighed any future gain. When disputes emerged between different Gambino crews over territory or business deals, he sat in deliberations, arguing his side, citing profits and past understandings. His ability to present himself as rational and focused on the family's broader interest helped him win many of these internal battles. By the turn of the decade, entering the early 1980s, the cumulative weight of his choices and the activities he controlled was beginning to press in from multiple sides. The DeMeo crew's record of intimidation and killings, though not publicly documented in detail, had become a central focus of secret grand juries. Investigators mapped their suspected involvement in car theft, fraud, loans, and disappearances across the city and beyond. Connections to bodies found in remote places, to vacant houses used as meeting points, and to frightened business owners began to form a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as random. For Anthony Gaggi, the skills and habits that had carried him from a Williamsburg childhood to a powerful position in the Gambino crime family were still in place. Caution, discipline, loyalty upward, and a relentless emphasis on financial results. But the terrain around him had changed. New legal tools, determined prosecutors, restless younger associates, and a boss whose own ambitions and controversies were drawing scrutiny all combined to make his position more precarious than it had ever been. The carefully layered insulation he had built between himself and the actions of the men below him would soon be tested in courtrooms and wiretap transcripts. As law enforcement moved from sketching organizational charts to bringing formal charges against the quiet captain who had, for so long, managed to operate just beyond the reach of the law. In the first years of the 1980s, the city around Anthony Gaggi was almost unrecognizable from the Brooklyn he had known as a child. Whole blocks bore the marks of economic decline, abandoned buildings and shuttered storefronts standing alongside the cramped homes of families who had nowhere else to go. Violent crime rates were high, the drug trade increasingly visible on street corners, and a general sense of instability ran through New York's working-class neighborhoods. For law enforcement, this was a crisis. For organized crime figures who could navigate the chaos, it was also an opportunity to tighten their grip on struggling communities. For Gaggi in particular, it was the period when the world he had helped shape began to close in around him. By then, he was in his mid-50s, an age that in another line of work might have brought thoughts of retirement. In his position, it brought more responsibility. As a caporgime in the Gambino family, he was responsible not just for his own survival, but for the supervision of a volatile crew whose activities reached far beyond the old neighborhood loan sharking and small-time gambling that had first brought him into the organization's favor. The DeMeo group, now firmly established around the Gemini Lounge, had become known, within underworld circles and increasingly within police stations, as one of the most feared criminal units in New York. Day to day, their range of activities reflected the changing economy. Auto theft remained a core business. The crew specialized in stealing late-model cars, altering their identification numbers, and funneling them through a network of crooked dealers, chop shops, and overseas buyers. In a city where car theft was already common, this operation stood out for its efficiency. Vehicles disappeared from streets and parking lots, reappearing days or weeks later in legitimate-looking sales rooms or foreign ports. Fraud schemes proliferated alongside this. Falsified insurance claims, phony vehicle registrations, and manipulated bank loans that used stolen cars as collateral. Loan sharking and gambling continued as essential pillars. In a period of rising interest rates and tightening bank credit, more small business owners than ever found they could not secure legitimate loans quickly enough to cover immediate needs. The informal, cash-on-the-spot loans offered by Gaggi's network filled that gap, at a price. Weekly payments, calculated on terms that would have been illegal in any regulated institution, trapped many borrowers in a cycle of dependency. For some, the arrangement remained concealed and manageable, an unwelcome expense folded into the cost of staying afloat. For others, especially those whose businesses faltered further, it became an unending burden. Law enforcement had not been blind to this expansion. Through the late 1970s, investigators at the federal and city levels had dedicated more attention and resources to understanding exactly how the Gandino family's Brooklyn operations worked. Eavesdropping equipment, informants, financial audits, and undercover officers all became part of a growing effort to document the pattern of loans, threats, and disappearances surrounding the DeMeo crew. Piece by piece, a picture emerged of a tightly controlled system that generated large profits for its organizers. In 1979, those efforts produced a public result. A federal indictment charged Anthony Gaggi, Roy DeMeo, and several others with operating a massive loan sharking and gambling operation. The case focused on the money side of their activities, interest rates, methods of collection, connections to legitimate businesses, deliberately avoiding the more difficult and dangerous question of homicides that investigators already suspected. For prosecutors, it was a strategic move. Financial crimes were easier to prove, victims more willing to testify, and records more accessible. The indictment came with conditions. When the court considered whether to release Gaggi on bail pending trial, prosecutors argued that he should be barred from any contact with known associates, including DeMeo and the regulars at Gemini. They portrayed him as the central command figure of a crew whose continued freedom posed a direct threat to witnesses and to the integrity of the case. Defense attorneys countered that these were exaggerated claims about an aging man with family responsibilities and only modest documented income. Faced with the judge's decision to permit release only if he accepted strict restrictions on his movements and contacts, Gaggi surprised some observers. Rather than agree to conditions that would, on paper, cut him off from his criminal network, he initially chose to remain in pretrial detention. From a purely legal standpoint, this seemed irrational. He was turning down the chance to sleep at home, to walk his own streets, and to present a more sympathetic image as a family man battling what his lawyers depicted as overreaching charges. From the perspective of the world he lived in, however, the decision made a certain sense. Accepting an order not to communicate with his crew would be tantamount to acknowledging, in writing, the existence and importance of those illegal ties. Even behind bars, he found ways to maintain influence. Family visits, consultations with lawyers, and messages passed through trusted intermediaries allowed him to stay informed about the crew's activities and to signal his wishes. The command structure he had helped build was designed precisely for such contingencies. Direct contact was not always necessary for orders to be understood and followed. Eventually, after months in detention and reassessment by his attorneys, he agreed to bail under modified conditions. By the early 1980s, he was again physically present in Brooklyn, though living under the watchful eye of federal supervision. If the loan sharking indictment was meant to slow or dismantle the DeMeo operation, it had only partial success. The crew adjusted, shifting some financial dealings further into the shadows and relying even more on trusted intermediaries. Their involvement in the stolen car trade remained particularly robust. That area, too, had begun attracting dedicated law enforcement attention. Multi-agency task forces pooled resources to identify patterns in car thefts, track suspicious transfers of vehicle titles, and scrutinize insurance claims. Investigators came to realize that what appeared to be a series of unrelated crimes was, in fact, the output of an organized system centered on a few key players. Simultaneously, the undercurrent of lethal violence associated with the crew intensified. Individuals connected to its operations, partners in business ventures gone sour, potential informants, and those who had fallen deeply into unpayable debt, began to vanish with unsettling regularity. Many of the disappearances were never formally linked in public records. The victims moved in circles where sudden absences were, unfortunately, not rare. Within law enforcement, however, detectives and agents comparing notes across precincts and boroughs saw the pattern. The names of victims often intersected with the same small group of suspects, and those suspects, in turn, all traced back to the quiet captain from Williamsburg and his most energetic lieutenant. Internally, within the Gambino family, concern was mounting. Paul Castellano's vision of a more businesslike organization depended on limiting chaos at the street level. A crew whose name was repeatedly associated, however quietly, with an unusually high number of killings, and whose leader, DeMeo, now faced serious legal jeopardy from both loan sharking and auto theft investigations, became a liability. Castellano had tolerated and even benefited from the crew's earnings for years. Now, the balance between profit and risk had shifted. The pressure on DeMeo became intense. Indictments tied to car theft operations, surveillance of his movements, and the growing likelihood that some associate might eventually cooperate with authorities all painted him, in the eyes of leadership, as a dangerously exposed figure. His knowledge of internal dealings was extensive. If he chose to talk under the weight of a possible long sentence, the damage to the family could be severe. Within this logic, preemptive action against someone once considered an asset became thinkable. In such matters, the chain of command ran through captains like Gaggi. Castellano, by multiple accounts from former insiders, conveyed his growing mistrust of DeMeo and his desire that the problem be resolved. The language, as always, was oblique, but unmistakable to those accustomed to reading it. For Gaggi, the situation replayed on a larger scale the terrible calculus he had faced with Chris Rosenberg. Now the man under scrutiny was not a young associate, but the architect of his crew's growth, someone whose initiative and ruthlessness had made them one of the most profitable crews in the family. He did not move quickly. That, too, reflected his personality and the ties involved. There is evidence that he hesitated, seeking ways to reassure Castellano without resorting to the most drastic step. Some sources describe him as stalling, promising that DeMeo could still be kept under control, that the investigations might come to nothing, or that if they did not, he could be persuaded to accept prison without turning informant. Whether these arguments were made out of genuine belief or out of reluctance to destroy a longtime ally is impossible to say with certainty. In any case, they did not satisfy the boss indefinitely. By early 1983, the internal verdict was final. DeMeo, once the rising star of the Brooklyn rackets, was now seen as too dangerous to leave alive. The responsibility for carrying out what amounted to a death sentence fell to the very men he had led, and above them to Gaggi, whose role was to ensure that Castellano's will was obeyed. The exact details of the decision-making process will never be fully known. Those involved spoke about it only under legal duress years later. What is clear is that DeMeo's last days were marked by anxiety. He sensed that he had lost favor. He altered his routines, went armed, and confided to some that he feared internal betrayal as much as law enforcement. In January 1983, his fears were realized. After failing to return home one day, he was reported missing by his family. About a week later, his body was discovered in the trunk of his car, which had been left in a Brooklyn neighborhood near a waterfront club. The scene, reported in newspapers as another gangland killing, confirmed to the public that someone significant had fallen. To law enforcement, the message was even clearer. The Gambino family was policing its own, removing a man they believed might endanger the entire organization. The reaction inside the DeMeo crew and the larger Gambino network was a mixture of shock, fear, and a grim sense of inevitability. For the younger men who had followed him, the reality was inescapable. If someone as powerful and well-connected as DeMeo could be killed on leadership's orders, then no one was safe when perceived as a threat. For Gaggi, the elimination of his most productive lieutenant may have felt like both a necessary step and a personal loss. Economically, it left a gaping hole. Emotionally, it underscored the harsh logic of the world he had chosen long ago. For investigators, DeMeo's death changed the stakes. The man they had long suspected of orchestrating dozens of killings and running extensive rackets was now beyond prosecution, but his removal did not end their interest in the network he had built. If anything, it spurred them to look higher. Who had authorized such an internal killing? Who had profited from the years of car theft, loan sharking, and gambling that had made the crew so powerful? Who had kept order among them, sat above them in the hierarchy, and transmitted instructions between them and Castellano? Anthony Gaggi's name, already prominent in confidential memos, moved even closer to the center of investigative focus. He had survived previous cases, including the loan sharking indictment, with damage but not destruction. He had demonstrated a capacity to endure short terms behind bars, continue to exert command through intermediaries, and return to the streets as if little had changed. Now, however, the climate was different. Federal prosecutors had more experience with RICO. The pool of potential informants was larger, thanks in part to the rising sentences handed down in narcotics and racketeering cases. And inside his own extended family, fissures were beginning to open. One of those fissures would soon involve a man who knew his habits, his speech patterns, and his decision-making style intimately. His nephew by marriage, Dominic Montiglio. Over the years, Montiglio had been drawn deeper into the orbit of the Gambino family, performing tasks that ranged from seemingly minor errands to more serious responsibilities. He had absorbed the rituals, the jargon, and the attitudes that defined the inner world of Cosa Nostra. He had also come to understand, in a direct and personal way, the cost of disobedience and the fragility of anyone's position, no matter how secure it seemed. As law enforcement pressure intensified in the wake of DeMeo's murder, Montiglio and others in his position faced a stark choice. Remaining loyal meant living with the constant risk of arrest, indictment on serious federal charges, and the possibility of being eliminated if someone higher up deemed them a liability. Cooperating with authorities meant breaking the most sacred rule of the world they lived in, accepting the danger that came with turning state's evidence, and severing ties with families and neighborhoods that defined their identities. It was a choice no one made lightly. While those private calculations unfolded, federal grand juries in Brooklyn and Manhattan heard testimony and reviewed evidence linking a broad web of crimes to the Gambino enterprise. Loan sharking, gambling, car theft, extortion, and a series of homicides and disappearances were analyzed not as isolated events, but as parts of a continuous pattern. Names were cross-referenced, financial records traced, and wiretap transcripts combed for indications of who gave orders and who carried them out. Gaggi, as the captain over the DeMeo group and long-standing manager of Brooklyn Rackets, featured prominently in these deliberations. By the mid-1980s, the work behind closed doors began to surface. A sweeping federal indictment charged Paul Castellano, Anthony Gaggi, and numerous associates with running a racketeering enterprise that incorporated the full spectrum of the DeMeo crew's activities. For the first time, the government was not just charging isolated loans or specific thefts. It was alleging that over many years, These men had used fear, corruption, and organized violence as tools of a continuing criminal organization. Among the counts were murders tied to the DeMeo operation, including those of insiders like Chris Rosenberg and suspected informants whose deaths had long gone officially unsolved. For Gaggi, the indictment represented the culmination of decades of choices. The cautious, disciplined approach that had once kept him beyond the reach of long sentences now faced a legal framework specifically designed to close the gap between those who ordered crimes and those who physically carried them out. He was no longer being portrayed as a neighborhood gambling figure with an unfortunate tendency to attract police suspicion. In the eyes of federal prosecutors, he was a central architect of one of the most destructive criminal crews in New York's modern history. The courtroom battles that followed would test not only the strength of the government's case, but the durability of the code that had governed his life since he first stepped into a Brooklyn social club as a teenager. As witnesses prepared to take the stand, some of them from his own extended family, and as recordings and documents were assembled to support charges that spanned years, Anthony Gaggi stood on the brink of a reckoning that would define the final chapter of his career and his life. The federal courthouse in Brooklyn, a granite slab of a building facing the East River, had seen its share of headline-making trials. Political scandals, corruption cases, spectacular bank robberies, all had passed through its courtrooms. But when Anthony Gaggi was brought there in shackles in the mid-1980s, alongside men with names long familiar to organized crime investigators, there was a sense among those in attendance that something different was underway. For decades, the leadership of New York's mafia families had managed to stay one step removed from the most serious crimes attributed to their organizations. Now prosecutors were trying to close that gap, using a law, RICO, that targeted not just individual acts, but the pattern and structure of the enterprise itself. On paper, the charges were dry legal phrases: racketeering conspiracy, extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and counts tied to specific killings carried out by the DeMeo crew over the previous decade. In the narrative the government laid out, those words translated into a network that had blended intimidation, financial exploitation, and lethal violence into a single continuing project. The Gambino family, as described in the indictment, was not a loose coalition of criminals but a structured hierarchy. At the street level, there were associates and soldiers. Above them, captains like Gaggi directed operations. At the top, the boss, Paul Castellano, and his closest advisors set overall policy and claimed a share of the profits. The indictment that named Gaggi and Castellano together was the product of years of work. After Roy DeMeo's murder in early 1983, investigators redoubled their efforts to document the crew's activities. The violent end of such a central figure only confirmed their belief that this was not a collection of unconnected thugs, but a disciplined unit woven into the fabric of a major crime family. Federal agents and prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York pooled everything they had: old surveillance logs, undercover reports from stolen car investigations, financial audits of suspicious businesses, and above all, statements from men who had decided to break the code of silence. Among the latter, the most important for understanding Anthony Gaggi's role was his nephew by marriage, Dominic Montiglio. For years, Montiglio had been a quiet presence in the background of the Gambino world, trusted enough to be present at sensitive conversations but never prominent enough to attract media attention. He knew the cadence of his uncle's voice, the way he weighed options, the terms he used to give approval or express displeasure. He knew who went to which social club, who delivered which envelopes of cash on which days, and which names drew respectful silence when mentioned. Montiglio's decision to cooperate with the government did not come all at once. Facing his own legal trouble, watching the collapse of the DeMeo crew, and seeing the growing willingness of federal authorities to hand out long sentences for racketeering and drug crimes, he gradually concluded that the future offered by continued loyalty was bleak. He also understood that in the new environment, with RICO and a more aggressive witness protection program, the government could offer a kind of safety and new identity that had not existed in earlier eras. When he approached investigators, they recognized immediately what he represented: an insider who could provide a detailed, coherent account of how the Brooklyn operations fit together. Over months of debriefings in secure locations, Montiglio and other emerging cooperators walked agents through the internal geography of the Gambino family as they knew it. They explained how the Gemini Lounge functioned as the nucleus of the DeMeo crew, how loan-sharking money moved from struggling shop owners to collectors, then upward to men like Gaggi, and how disputes were resolved away from public view. They described the expectations placed on a captain: to enforce the boss's policies, to rein in subordinates when they threatened to bring unwanted attention, and to arrange for severe measures when someone, inside or outside the organization, put the enterprise at risk. The stories they told were not just about money. They spoke of people who disappeared after crossing certain lines, of associates who had become potential informants, of young men like Chris Rosenberg, whose involvement in narcotics and contact with federal drug agents had drawn anger from Castellano and led to a fatal resolution. Again and again, they positioned Gaggi at the fulcrum point between street-level action and upper-level orders. He did not carry out the killings himself, they said. That was the work of crews like DeMeo's. But he knew when they were being planned, approved them when they aligned with the family's interests, and sometimes transmitted the very orders that set them in motion. For prosecutors assembling their case, this fit the logic of RICO exactly. The law was designed to hold leaders accountable for the pattern of crimes committed by the enterprise, not only for the acts they personally performed. To make that argument convincingly to a jury, they needed to show that people like Gaggi were not distant, unwitting beneficiaries of isolated crimes but active managers of a continuing strategy. Montiglio's testimony, supported in crucial places by other insiders and by corroborating records, promised to do that. As the government's case developed, events in the underworld brought a separate shock. On a cold evening in December 1985, Paul Castellano stepped out of a car in front of Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan and walked toward the entrance. He never made it inside. Gunmen approached quickly, fired repeatedly, and vanished into the city. Television cameras arriving on the scene captured images of the boss of the Gambino family lying on the sidewalk, covered with a white sheet. News anchors spoke breathlessly of an apparent gangland execution in the heart of Manhattan's business district. The impact reverberated far beyond the cordoned-off block around Sparks. Inside the federal detention centers where Gaggi and some of his co-defendants were being held, the news moved quickly from cell to cell. Castellano had been more than a superior in an organizational chart. He had been the guarantor of a certain vision of how the business should be run: low profile, focused on unions and industries, deeply suspicious of the reckless violence associated with some younger crews. His death signaled not only an internal power struggle, but the likely ascendancy of more flamboyant figures like John Gotti, whose willingness to invite public attention ran counter to everything that men of Gaggi's generation had been taught. For Gaggi personally, the assassination carried multiple meanings. On one level, he had lost his boss and principal protector at the top of the family's hierarchy. Whatever complaints Castellano might have had about the Brooklyn crews, he had understood their value and the logic of keeping someone like Gaggi in place to manage them. On another level, the manner of Castellano's death confirmed that the old rules of conflict management, where disputes at the top were carefully negotiated to avoid open warfare, were under strain. If a sitting boss could be shot down in front of a restaurant in prime evening hours, then no one, anywhere, could count on the veil of semi-invisibility that had once insulated Cosa Nostra's leadership. From the government's perspective, Castellano's murder had a more practical consequence. The charges pending against him in the racketeering case were formally dismissed, leaving Gaggi and the remaining defendants to face trial without the man once described as the top of their pyramid. Prosecutors adjusted, emphasizing that RICO did not require the presence of the nominal boss to proceed. The enterprise they described in their opening statements was not a single person, but a system of relationships held together by shared rules, economic interests, and a culture of enforced silence. When the trial finally began, the courtroom filled with a mix of law enforcement officials, journalists, relatives of defendants, and in some cases, relatives of victims. Court artists sketched quick lines to capture the faces of the accused, stony, watchful, trying to project calm. Gaggi, in his early 60s by then, looked older than photographs from the 1970s suggested. Years of stress, intermittent imprisonment, and the unrelenting pressure of leadership had left their mark. Still, he carried himself with the same composed, slightly aloof demeanor that had long been his shield. He conferred quietly with his attorneys, occasionally took notes, and watched the proceedings with the intensity of a man who knew every choice made in that room could change the rest of his life. The prosecution began by educating the jury. Many of the 12 citizens in the box had been only dimly aware of how Cosa Nostra operated beyond what they had seen in films or read in newspapers. Assistant U.S. attorneys explained the structure of the Gambino family: boss, underboss, consigliere, captains, soldiers, and associates, and the concept of our thing as an oath-bound society. They introduced the idea of tribute payments, of territories informally controlled by different crews, and of the unwritten but strictly enforced rules against cooperating with the government. Then they moved to specifics. Charts projected on screens showed interlocking circles, stolen car operations, loan sharking networks, illegal gambling, extortion. At the center of many of these diagrams, prosecutors placed the names of the defendants, with Anthony Gaggi appearing again and again as the point where money and information converged. The government's narrative linked him to the DeMeo crew not as a distant acquaintance, but as the man who had sponsored DeMeo, promoted him, and profited from his enterprises. The most dramatic moments came when cooperating witnesses took the stand. Dominic Montiglio, under the protection of marshals, walked to the witness box, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Facing his uncle across the courtroom, he began to describe the world he had entered as a younger man. The social clubs and back rooms, the little rituals of respect, the envelopes of cash placed on tables or slid into pockets, the late-night phone calls when someone had to decide how to handle a problem. He spoke about Roy DeMeo's rise under Gaggi's guidance, about the way the Gemini Lounge served as an unofficial command post, and about the mix of admiration and fear that DeMeo inspired among his followers. He detailed how loan sharking worked in practice, which businesses in Brooklyn and Queens paid tribute, how collectors visited those who were late, and how disagreements over territory or clients were brought up the chain for resolution. Time and again, when he described critical junctions in these stories, he pointed to his uncle as the person who had the final say. When he turned to the subject of killings, the courtroom grew still. Montiglio did not dwell on physical details. The prosecutors, mindful of both legal limits and juror sensibilities, guided him away from graphic description. Instead, they focused on process and authority. Who decided that someone had to be eliminated? How were those decisions communicated? What language did people use to signal that approval had been granted? In response, Montiglio described meetings where Gaggi, sometimes after speaking with higher-ranking figures, indicated that it had to be done, or that the boss wants it taken care of, phrases everyone present understood as authorization. Other cooperators, not related to Gaggi by blood but connected to the DeMeo crew, reinforced this picture. They attested that serious actions were not undertaken lightly or on the personal initiative of a single hot-headed associate. In the disciplined environment of the Gambino family, They said, people like DeMeo did not move against significant targets, including potential witnesses or longtime associates, without clearing it with their captain. Through their combined testimony, prosecutors sought to establish that the pattern of killings and intimidation was a logical, foreseeable consequence of the enterprise that men like Gaggi had chosen to lead. The defense strategy was built on attacking credibility and reframing roles. Defense attorneys reminded the jury repeatedly that the government's central witnesses were themselves admitted criminals, some of whom had confessed to serious offenses in exchange for leniency. They asked whether such men could be trusted, or whether they were embellishing their stories to please prosecutors. They highlighted inconsistencies in dates and names, tried to suggest that some meetings described might have been about mundane matters, and argued that the prosecutors had woven together a patchwork of half-truths into a grand conspiracy theory. For Gaggi specifically, his lawyers worked to portray him as a marginal figure in a neighborhood gambling and loans business, someone whose reputation had been magnified by fearful supposition rather than concrete proof. They emphasized that he had already been punished in the past for the confrontation with FBI agents in the 1970s and for earlier loan sharking charges, and argued that the government was now trying to make him pay a second time by recasting old, relatively minor offenses as components of a sweeping racketeering story. When witnesses claimed that cryptic phrases from him signaled approval for killings, the defense suggested they were reading sinister meaning into words that could just as easily have referred to financial or personal disputes. As the weeks wore on, the strain on everyone involved grew. Jurors listened day after day to accounts of threats, secret meetings, and betrayals. Family members of defendants spent long hours in the gallery, watching as relatives and former friends took the stand against them. Federal marshals escorting cooperators remained alert, aware that the decision to testify against the Gambino family carried real risks despite the layers of security. For Gaggi, the trial was both a public reckoning and a private test of endurance. His health, always a concern for a man of his age under such stress, began to deteriorate. He complained of chest pains and shortness of breath. Some days he appeared drawn and pale, conferring with his attorneys in low tones, occasionally closing his eyes as testimony droned on about events he knew well. Doctors examined him, and the court was periodically updated on his condition. The judge allowed brief recesses and medical checks, but the proceedings had to continue. Co-defendants, witnesses, and jurors had all been marshaled for this long-planned confrontation. In the spring of 1986, the accumulated pressure reached a breaking point. During one phase of the trial, after a day in which witnesses had again placed him at the center of crucial decisions, Gaggi suffered a serious cardiac episode. He was rushed from custody to a hospital under guard. Reports filed with the court described his condition as grave but stabilizing. For the first time, it became clear that he might not physically be able to see the trial through to a verdict. The judge faced a difficult procedural decision. The law required that defendants be able to understand the proceedings and participate in their defense. If Gaggi's health prevented that, continuing to try him alongside his co-defendants risked an appeal and potential retrial. On the other hand, delaying the entire case for months or more while he recovered, if he recovered, was untenable. After reviewing medical testimony, the judge opted to sever his case from the rest. The trial would continue for the other defendants, while the charges against Gaggi would be addressed separately once his condition became clearer. In practical terms, this meant that, as the jury eventually returned guilty verdicts against several of his co-defendants on racketeering and murder charges, sending them to federal prison for life, Anthony Gaggi lay in a guarded hospital bed, hearing news of their convictions secondhand through lawyers and security personnel. The enterprise he had helped build and manage for years was being dismantled in a courtroom he was no longer well enough to attend. The code he had lived by, never cooperate, never admit, never acknowledged the organization, remained intact on his lips, but the legal system he had once considered a distant, manageable threat had finally closed around him. The severing of his case did not mean freedom or exoneration. The racketeering indictment remained in force, and prosecutors made clear their intention to pursue it once he was medically fit. But the combination of his failing health and the government's broader successes against the Gambino family changed the context in which his fate would be decided. Other captains and soldiers were receiving decades-long or life sentences. The commission trial in Manhattan, targeting the leadership of multiple New York families, was moving forward with its own set of convictions. The age of brief, easily survived prison terms for senior figures in Cosa Nostra was over. For a man shaped by the tight, secretive Brooklyn underworld of the 1930s and 1940s, the transformation was profound. The tools he had relied on, discretion, indirect communication, the assumed silence of subordinates, had been systematically undermined by new laws, new investigative techniques, and a new willingness among insiders to testify. As he moved from hospital ward to prison medical facility, facing the prospect of dying in federal custody rather than in the relative comfort of his Brooklyn home, Anthony Gaggi encountered the ultimate cost of the life he had chosen. Not only the suffering inflicted on others through the enterprise he served, but the collapse of the very system of protection and loyalty that had once seemed unshakable. In the months that followed his removal from the courtroom, Anthony Gaggi's world contracted to a succession of hospital rooms and secure prison wards. The man who had once moved quietly but freely through Brooklyn's cafes and social clubs now lived under buzzing fluorescent lights, monitored not by lookouts on street corners, but by federal marshals and medical staff. The routine that had structured his adult life, meetings with captains, whispered consultations with associates, late-night calls about troublesome debtors, was replaced by the monotonous rhythms of incarceration. Medication schedules, visiting hours, legal appointments carefully supervised by guards. His heart condition, which had first come to public notice during the 1980s racketeering proceedings, was no temporary scare. Medical reports filed with the court described chronic cardiovascular disease, the result of age, stress, and years of chain smoking and poor diet. Even after the immediate crisis of his courtroom collapse passed, his health remained fragile. Simple movements left him short of breath. Climbing a short flight of stairs required rest at the top. Prison doctors adjusted his medications and monitored his blood pressure, but the underlying condition could not be reversed. Legally, his situation was complex. The severing of his case from that of his co-defendants did not wipe the slate clean. Existing convictions, including his earlier federal case for the 1970s confrontation with FBI agents and subsequent loan sharking charges, still stood. The pending RICO indictment, which tied him to the broad spectrum of crimes associated with the DeMeo crew, remained active. Prosecutors made clear, in filings and public statements, that they intended to try him separately if and when doctors deemed him stable enough to sit in a courtroom and consult meaningfully with his lawyers. In practical terms, that meant that even if he had somehow managed to win acquittal on the severed charges, he would still have faced significant prison time from the sentences already imposed. For a man in his early 60s with serious heart disease, the math was stark. The prospect of returning to life as a free man in Brooklyn, even in a reduced, retirement-like role, grew steadily more remote. Those who visited him, relatives, attorneys, occasional priests, found a man who remained outwardly composed, but who understood that the arc of his life was unlikely to bend back toward the streets of his youth. The external world continued its own rapid changes while he lay in custody. In 1986, the commission trial in Manhattan concluded with guilty verdicts for the formal heads of several New York families, including the leadership of the Genovese and Lucchese organizations. These convictions, widely covered in the press, were hailed as a turning point in the government's long battle against Cosa Nostra. The idea that senior bosses were beyond the practical reach of the law was, at least for the moment, shattered. Within the Gambino family, Castellano's assassination had already opened the door for a new kind of boss. John Gotti, whose crew from the Ozone Park area of Queens had long chafed at Castellano's buttoned-down style, emerged as the new leader. Where men of Gaggi's generation had prized anonymity, Gotti embraced a more theatrical persona. He patronized neighborhood restaurants, dressed in conspicuously expensive suits, and became a regular feature in tabloid headlines as the Dapper Don. Television cameras captured him leaving court with easy smiles and jokes, presenting an image of immunity that infuriated prosecutors and, in its own way, unsettled more conservative figures within his own organization. From his hospital bed and then from the medical unit of a federal prison, Gaggi could only watch these developments from a distance, through newspapers and occasional conversations. To some extent, they confirmed what his own experience had already shown. The old tactics that had once kept the upper and middle tiers of Cosa Nostra relatively secure were no longer reliable. Aggressive publicity, harsher sentencing laws, RICO, and a growing pool of insiders willing to cooperate had combined to create a landscape in which simply avoiding direct contact with specific crimes was no longer enough. What he did not do, according to every credible record, was cross the line he had spent his life enforcing. Unlike his nephew Montiglio and other insiders, he never agreed to cooperate with authorities. No proffer sessions, no debriefings, no attempts to exchange information for a reduced sentence or improved conditions appear in the archival record. From the government's perspective, this was frustrating. From the perspective of the world he came from, it was the ultimate test of loyalty. Whether this steadfastness was driven by genuine adherence to the code, by fatalism about his chances of leaving prison alive, or by concern for the safety of his family and remaining associates cannot be definitively known. What is clear is that he went to his death without publicly acknowledging the structure he had served. The practical consequences of that choice were considerable. Without his cooperation, prosecutors had to rely on the testimony of other witnesses and the documentary evidence already in hand to tell the story of the DeMeo crew and its links to Gambino leadership. They succeeded enough to secure life sentences for several surviving members of the crew and other associates in related cases. But some questions about who had ordered which killings, what had been said in which meetings, and how far up knowledge of specific crimes had gone remained the subject of educated inference rather than fully documented fact. Back in Brooklyn and the surrounding boroughs, the vacuum left by his absence was gradually filled by others. The DeMeo crew, once a tightly knit and feared unit, had been effectively dismantled, some killed, others imprisoned for life, a few scattered. The rackets they had controlled did not vanish. Illegal markets tend to regenerate when demand remains. Instead, other Gambino crews and, in some instances, other crime families stepped into the gaps. Gambling continued, though increasingly pushed into more discreet forms as law enforcement cracked down on overt operations. Loan sharking persisted wherever banks remained inaccessible to the desperate. Car theft, while less centralized than in the DeMeo days, remained a persistent problem across the city. Yet the tenor of the underworld had undeniably shifted. The combination of federal pressure and internal upheaval made the kind of sprawling, semi-autonomous syndicate that Gaggi and DeMeo had built more difficult to sustain. Younger aspiring criminals could no longer assume that a well-run crew, some corrupt contacts, and loyalty to a protective captain would keep them insulated. They saw instead a pattern of long sentences, frozen assets, and aging figures dying in prison facilities far from the neighborhoods that had once feared them. For Gaggi's own family, the last years of his life were marked by the dissonance that often accompanies the downfall of a figure like him. Inside their home, He was remembered as a demanding but devoted husband and father, a man who insisted on education for his children, who discouraged them from even minor brushes with the law, and who could be, by some accounts, tender. Private moments. Outside, his name had become shorthand in media coverage for the worst excesses of Brooklyn's organized crime in the 1970s and 1980s. Articles chronicling the DeMeo crew's record of violence and corruption routinely identified him as their sponsor and handler, the quiet figure whose approval had made their enterprises possible. Visits to see him in custody brought those conflicting images into sharp relief. Security procedures, searches, locked doors, identification checks emphasized his status as a federal prisoner. Yet when he walked into the visiting room in a prison uniform rather than the conservative suits he had once favored, he remained, to his relatives, the same familiar person. Conversations avoided the details of his case. Monitored by guards and recording equipment, there was little he could safely say. Instead, they spoke of family matters, illnesses, marriages, school progress, the fates of distant cousins. The everyday concerns of a Brooklyn family threaded around the unspoken reality that the patriarch they were addressing was unlikely ever to return home. On April 17, 1988, that unspoken understanding became final. At a New York hospital where he had been transferred for specialized treatment under guard, Anthony Gaggi died of heart failure at the age of 62. News of his death moved quickly through both law enforcement channels and the underworld. For federal agents and prosecutors, it marked the end of a long pursuit. A man they had first marked as a promising associate in internal memos decades earlier, then tracked through wiretaps, witness statements, and court cases, had finally been removed from the chessboard not by conviction and sentencing, but by the steady attrition of disease and age. The public record of his passing was brief. Newspapers noted the death of a reputed Gambino captain, recalling his alleged role in supervising the DeMeo crew and his association with Castellano. They mentioned his previous convictions, his pending RICO case, and the fact that he had been in federal custody at the time of his death. There were no long obituaries, no personal remembrances in mainstream publications. The man who had spent his life avoiding public attention, and whose most notorious activities had been designed to remain hidden, left behind little that journalists could quote beyond court documents and law enforcement summaries. His funeral in Brooklyn, held under the watchful eyes of plainclothes detectives and FBI agents, reflected the diminished, embattled state of the organization he had served. In earlier decades, the passing of a respected captain might have drawn a large, visible turnout of men in dark suits, lining sidewalks as an unspoken show of strength. By 1988, caution and legal pressure had thinned such displays. Attendance was more subdued, with many longtime associates now in prison, under indictment, or wary of attracting attention by appearing alongside someone so closely associated with a case that had already sent others away for life. Nevertheless, the rituals of his community were observed. A church service marked his passing, prayers were offered in Italian and English, and his body was committed to the ground in a Brooklyn cemetery not far from where he had been born and raised. For those who had known him only as a family member or neighbor, the burial closed a chapter of personal history. For law enforcement officers quietly watching from a distance, it symbolized the end of an era in which men like him had loomed large in the shadow economy of their city. The federal racketeering case that had been pending against him did not, of course, proceed. Charges against a deceased defendant are routinely dismissed as moot. Court records show formal entries noting his death and terminating the action. For prosecutors, there was a measure of frustration in this. They had invested years in building a case that, at least in his instance, would never reach a final verdict. Yet they also understood that their broader goals had been achieved. The DeMeo crew had been dismantled, its surviving core members imprisoned. The Gambino family's Brooklyn rackets were shaken and fragmented, and the legal tools and cooperative witnesses developed in cases like his had proved effective enough to change the calculus for the entire American mafia. In the years immediately after his death, public attention shifted to other figures and other trials. John Gotti's own courtroom battles and eventual conviction in 1992, widely televised and covered in exhaustive detail, captured the popular imagination. New scandals and new criminal enterprises, drug cartels, white-collar frauds, international money laundering schemes, began to occupy the investigative energies of law enforcement and the curiosity of the public. The quiet captain from Williamsburg, whose command style had belonged to an earlier phase of organized crime, receded from the front pages. It would not be long, however, before writers and researchers returned to his story as part of a broader effort to understand how the underworld had actually operated in New York's most turbulent decades. Journalists digging into the history of the DeMeo crew, authors interviewing retired detectives and former associates, and scholars examining the application of RICO law all found his name in their source material. In their accounts, he appears not as a flamboyant outlaw, but as a pivotal manager, someone whose disciplined approach and long memory helped knit together dozens of individual crimes into a coherent, durable enterprise. Those retrospective portrayals did not romanticize him. They emphasized the damage done by the loan-sharking operations he oversaw, the climate of fear sustained by his crew's willingness to use fatal violence, and the way his choices had drawn younger men into a life that often ended in prison or early death. They also placed him within the context of his upbringing, a child of Sicilian immigrants shaped by economic hardship, by a neighborhood culture that viewed official authority with suspicion, and by family connections that opened doors into Cosa Nostra while closing off more conventional paths. By the late 20th century, with many of the key players dead or imprisoned, Anthony Gaggi had become a kind of case study. For law enforcement professionals, his trajectory, from street-level associate to powerful captain, from feared neighborhood figure to aging prisoner dying under guard, illustrated both the appeal and the limitations of the mafia lifestyle. For students of urban history, his life offered a window into how organized crime embedded itself in struggling communities, exploiting vulnerabilities while also, in some cases, providing informal services that official institutions failed to deliver. The neighborhoods where he had risen bore the scars of his era, but also showed signs of renewal. Parts of Williamsburg and surrounding areas, once defined by poverty and the presence of social clubs linked to the families, began to change as new populations moved in, old buildings were renovated, and different kinds of businesses took root. Few of the new residents knew the full history of the storefronts they passed. The private clubs where envelopes of cash had once changed hands behind drawn blinds were, in many cases, gone or repurposed, their past lives remembered only by older locals and the detectives who had watched them from parked cars. For those who did remember, Anthony Gaggi remained a symbol of a particular time, the decades when New York's mafia families wielded significant influence over everyday economic life, when small business owners knew that missing a weekly payment to the wrong man could have consequences more immediate than any bank's foreclosure notice, and when the boundary between the legitimate and the illicit could seem more like a negotiated truce than a bright line. His death in custody in 1988 did not erase that history, but it marked the point at which the system he represented began, in earnest, to give way under the combined pressures of law enforcement, social change, and internal decay. In the end, the story of his final years is less about dramatic scenes than about attrition and inevitability. A man who had spent his life believing that careful planning, strict discipline, and unwavering loyalty could manage any threat found himself confronted with a legal and cultural shift he could not control. The same qualities that had once allowed him to navigate the dangerous world of Brooklyn's underworld: caution, patience, and a commitment to the code proved insufficient against a justice system that had finally learned how to map and attack the organizational structures he embodied. His passing closed one individual life, but the questions raised by that life, the origins of organized crime, its impact on communities, and the means by which societies confront it, would continue to shape debates long after he was gone. Looking back over the arc of Anthony Gaggi's life, it is hard to separate the man from the city that made him. His story runs almost exactly parallel to New York's 20th century journey, from a port of entry for impoverished immigrants, to an industrial powerhouse, to a city racked by decline and crime, and finally to a metropolis reshaped by new laws, new economies, and new populations. He was born in 1925 into the tenements of Williamsburg, rose through the ranks of an organization that thrived in the cracks of that world, and died in federal custody in 1988, just as the legal order that had once seemed unable to touch men like him finally began to gain the upper hand. The roots of his path lay in that first setting. The Brooklyn of his childhood was a place where Sicilian and Southern Italian families like his clung to each other for security and identity. Work was hard, pay was low, and the institutions that might have offered protection, police, courts, banks, were distant and not always trustworthy from the point of view of newcomers. In that void, informal systems flourished. Favors were traded, disputes settled quietly among neighbors, and men with reputations for getting things done, even by dubious means, commanded a particular kind of respect. Gaggi's family, through marriage, had connections to one of those men, Frank Scalise, a powerful figure in the organization that would become the Gambino crime family. For a boy growing up in a cramped Brooklyn apartment, watching parents struggle to keep food on the table through the Depression and into the war years, such a relative embodied a different possibility. Scalise dressed better, spoke with authority, and moved in circles closed to ordinary laborers. No one sat young Anthony down and offered him a written job description in Cosa Nostra, but the path was there, well-trodden, visible to anyone who knew where to look. The choices he made as a teenager and young man set him firmly on that path. Instead of embracing the limited but lawful options open to him, factory work, a trade, perhaps a small business, he gravitated toward the social clubs and corner groups where gambling, off-the-books loans, and favors exchanged for quiet, unrecorded payments formed the real economy. There, his temperament fixed his trajectory. He was not a swaggering street tough. He was serious, observant, cautious. Older men noticed that he kept his mouth shut and his head clear. In a world where secrecy and reliability were at a premium, those were the qualities that counted. By the time he was a young adult in the 1950s, the Italian-American underworld had solidified into what law enforcement would, slowly and reluctantly, come to recognize as a national criminal confederation, Cosa Nostra. The five families in New York, Lucchese, Genovese, Colombo, Bonanno, and Gambino, divided up territory and influence, sat together to settle disputes, and developed an internal code that blended imported Sicilian traditions with American urban realities. Within that system, formal membership, the moment a man became made, pricking his finger, swearing an oath, marked a definitive break with the ordinary world. Sometime in those post-war years, Anthony Gaggi crossed that threshold. From then on, every important decision in his life was filtered through the obligations that came with it. His domain was money. Under the leadership of Carlo Gambino and later Paul Castellano, the family emphasized low visibility, high-profit rackets, illegal gambling, usurious loans, quiet control of labor unions and wholesale markets. Gaggi proved particularly adept at running gambling and loan sharking operations in Brooklyn. He did not stand in doorways taking bets himself. He oversaw networks. Bookmakers and collectors reported to him, directly or through intermediaries. Small business owners behind on taxes or rent, gamblers who could not cover losses, tradesmen whose trucks needed repairs they could not afford on short notice. These were his customer base. On the surface, such transactions could be framed as ordinary loans and entertainment. A man went to a back room rather than a bank, to a neighborhood bookie rather than a licensed betting parlor. But the terms and enforcement mechanisms set them apart. Interest rates far exceeded anything legal, compounding weekly rather than annually. A missed payment invited not a late fee but a visit, first a reminder, then a threat, and if the debt remained unresolved, the risk of far heavier consequences. Over time, many borrowers found themselves paying and paying, never seeing the principal shrink, living with an anxiety that seeped into every aspect of their lives. That pattern, people in desperate circumstances turning to unofficial lenders, then becoming trapped, was replicated across working-class neighborhoods all over the city. In that sense, Gaggi was not an anomaly. He was a representative figure. What made his story stand out was the scale he eventually reached and the kind of crew he chose to sponsor. When he took a chance on a younger, energetic associate named Roy DeMeo in the 1960s, he saw in him a way to expand his own reach. DeMeo's stolen car operations, his flair for recruiting tough, loyal young men, and his willingness to push into new frauds and schemes promised profits that would elevate his sponsors' standing in the family. Under Gaggi's guidance and protection, that promise was fulfilled, and then some. The Gemini Lounge in Canarsie, nominally a simple neighborhood bar, became the epicenter of a powerful crew whose activities reached from Brooklyn to New Jersey and beyond. Stolen cars were only one aspect. There were fraudulent loans and insurance scams, gambling dens, and an ever-expanding network of borrowers bound to them by debt. To law enforcement, trying to piece together this world from scattered reports, the crew's combination of organization and menace stood out. To the Gambino leadership, it represented a lucrative, if increasingly risky, asset. The crimes associated with the DeMeo Group did not stop at financial exploitation. Over the course of the late 1970s and early 1980s, people linked to their operations, or simply perceived as threats, began to disappear. Business partners who had fallen out of favor, potential informants, and deeply indebted borrowers went missing, or were found dead under circumstances that clearly suggested foul play, even when investigative files could not prove exactly what had happened. In those years, the area of Brooklyn that fed into Gaggi's crew developed a reputation among police and locals alike as a place where certain names, once associated with the Gemini Lounge, had a way of vanishing. Here, the character of Gaggi's role took on its starkest form. He was not on the scenes where those disappearances occurred. He was not the one wielding weapons or disposing of remains. But as later testimony and investigations convinced courts and historians alike, he was the man in the middle, the one who judged whether a delinquent borrower should be given more time or treated as an example, the one who relayed Castellano's furious orders in narcotics cases, the one who, in the coded language of Cosa Nostra, could say that it had to be done, and know everyone present understood the implications. When informal toleration of that system finally gave way to serious legal challenge, the institutions that confronted him were very different from those of his youth. In the early 1960s, when Joseph Valachi first publicly confirmed the existence of Cosa Nostra, the FBI and federal prosecutors were still learning the basics. By the mid-1970s, with RICO on the books and the Witness Security Program able to offer meaningful protection and new identities, their capacity to penetrate tightly knit criminal organizations had grown dramatically. Gaggi's own clashes with law enforcement reflected this evolution. His 1970s conviction for shooting at FBI agents, born out of a chaotic moment when he and his associates apparently mistook their pursuers for robbers, showed how thin the line between his world and the state's could become. The loan-sharking indictment at the end of that decade, with its tight bail conditions and focus on financial patterns rather than isolated incidents, hinted at the enterprise-wide strategies prosecutors were starting to use. The racketeering case assembled in the 1980s, tying him and Castellano to a broad pattern of crimes linked to the DeMeo crew, was the culmination of those efforts. The evidence marshaled in that case, especially the testimony of his nephew by marriage, Dominic Montiglio, provided one of the most detailed insider portraits of a Gambino captain's working life ever placed on the record. Montiglio's descriptions of meetings in social clubs, of lists of borrowers reviewed like ledgers, of quiet directives about who should be pressured and who should be protected, pulled back the curtain on a world that had long relied on secrecy as its main defense. Other cooperators confirmed that picture. Together, they showed that the harms inflicted by Gaggi's operations were not random or incidental. They were part of a deliberate system designed to generate and maintain power. For the communities entwined in that system, the damage was long-lasting. Families bankrupted by impossible interest rates did not appear in the headlines, but their struggles shaped neighborhoods. Young men drawn into the crew's orbit, lured by promises of easy money and a certain street prestige, often ended up dead, imprisoned, or living under assumed names after turning state's evidence. Business owners who tried to resist or find escape routes from under the crew's shadow lived for years in fear, their choices constrained by the possibility of retaliation. The myth of the benevolent neighborhood mobster, someone who merely took a cut while protecting local people, does not stand up well against the stories documented in court records and remembered by those who lived through that era. At the same time, any full account of Gaggi's life has to reckon with the internal logic of the world he inhabited. From his earliest days as a low-level associate, he was taught that loyalty to the family came before loyalty to the state, and in some cases even before loyalty to blood relatives. The code of silence, omerta, was not simply a pragmatic tactic. It was presented as an ethical requirement. Men who broke it were portrayed as traitors deserving the harshest punishment. Loved ones of such men were expected to accept that judgment, or, at the very least, not publicly challenge it. Against that background, his refusal to cooperate with authorities, even when facing the prospect of dying behind bars, makes a certain grim sense. It was the ultimate affirmation of the values he had spent his life enforcing. Where younger insiders like Montiglio concluded that the code no longer offered them a viable future and chose to trade information for safety, he embodied the older belief that a man's honor, as defined in that closed culture, depended on taking secrets to the grave. From a broader societal perspective, stubborn adherence to such a code protected no one but other criminals and denied closure to victims, families. From within his own frame of reference, however, it was the last thing he could cling to as the rest of his world crumbled. In the decades since his death, the story of Anthony Gaggi has been retold and examined in various forms. Books like Murder Machine by Gene Mustain and Jerry Capeside, and later works on the DeMeo crew, drew on court transcripts, law enforcement files, and interviews with former associates to sketch his role in detail. Documentaries and long-form articles have revisited the Gemini Lounge, the car theft rings, the loan sharking networks, often using his name as shorthand for the kind of calculated, managerial underworld figure who made more flamboyant gangsters possible. These accounts, while sometimes dramatized for effect, converge on a consistent portrait. A man who avoided the limelight but whose decisions had life and death consequences for many others. The legal and cultural shifts that his era helped catalyze have also left their mark. RICO, initially a controversial and relatively untested statute, is now a standard tool in the prosecution of complex criminal enterprises, from remaining mafia factions to street gangs and corporate fraud rings. The Federal Witness Security Program, refined in cases like his, has relocated thousands of former criminals and their families, disrupting networks that once relied on the certainty of silence. Police departments and prosecutors' offices have developed specialized organized crime units, drawing on lessons learned from surveilling men like Gaggi to better understand how illicit economies adapt and survive. Meanwhile, the neighborhoods that once formed his base are scarcely recognizable. Parts of Williamsburg have gentrified dramatically, with rising rents, new high-rise buildings, and an influx of residents whose livelihoods lie in creative industries, technology, and finance, rather than in factories or the docks. The demographic and economic shifts that reshape those streets have not only changed the faces seen in local bars and on stoops, they have also altered the opportunities and pressures that once made a life in Cosa Nostra seem attractive, or, in some families, almost inevitable. Organized crime has not disappeared from New York, but its forms and key players have changed, fragmented, and in many cases moved away from the highly concentrated, family-based systems of the mid-20th century. For historians and criminologists, Anthony Gaggi stands as a useful illustration of how organized crime embeds itself in the fabric of a city. He was not a caricature of evil, nor was he a misunderstood Robin Hood figure. He was a product of specific social and economic conditions, someone who chose to exploit those conditions rather than challenge them, and who helped build a structure that preyed on the vulnerabilities of the very communities he came from. His rise and fall show how such structures draw strength from cultural habits, distrust of formal authority, loyalty to kin and neighborhood, admiration for men who appear to command respect, and how they can be weakened when the state learns to speak to those same instincts through more effective law enforcement and social support. On a more intimate level, his life raises questions that echo beyond his particular story. How much of a person's character is shaped by the circumstances into which they are born, and how much by the choices they make within those circumstances? Could a boy growing up in a different Brooklyn, one with more accessible legitimate opportunities and less entrenched criminal influence, have taken a different path? Or did the combination of family connections, personal temperament, and historical timing make some version of his trajectory almost inevitable? There are no definitive answers, but the questions themselves help frame the human dimension of what might otherwise be viewed only as an account of crimes and punishments. For those who craft narratives about his era, documentary filmmakers, writers, educators, there is a responsibility to avoid both sanitizing and sensationalizing. The world in which Anthony Gaggi rose and fell was not glamorous. It was marked by fear, by exploitation, and by the quiet suffering of many people whose names never appeared in indictments. At the same time, it was bound up with genuine feelings of loyalty, identity, and community among those inside it. To understand it is not to excuse it, but to recognize that confronting organized crime effectively requires more than arrests and convictions. It requires grappling with the underlying conditions that allow such systems to take root. As New York moves further into the 21st century, the shadow of figures like Gaggi grows longer and fainter, but it has not vanished entirely. Older residents still remember the days when certain corners were known by the names of particular captains, when the presence of an unmarked social club on a block changed the unspoken rules of conduct there. Younger generations encounter his name in books and shows, often stripped of context, as part of a broader fascination with the mythology of the mafia. Between those two perspectives lies the real legacy of Anthony Gaggi, a reminder that behind every romanticized image of the underworld stands a complex, often painful history of decisions, structures, and consequences that shaped the lives of countless individuals and the character of a great city itself. His story, when told in full, is not only the story of a Gambino captain. It is also the story of how New York learned, at great cost, to confront the dark economies that had grown up alongside its official ones, and how the combined pressures of law, social change, and individual choices eventually brought down men who once seemed unassailable in their carefully constructed anonymity. In that broader sense, the life and death of Anthony Gaggi marked not just the end of one man's career in organized crime, but the closing of a chapter in the history of American cities and the forces that have shaped them.